Ranking the conferences. We do it each and every offseason here at MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football, when we compare and run through all the games that were played between the Power 5 conferences and rank the conferences. And you'll have to, of course, join us after the season for that official ranking of the conferences when all the games are complete. But since most of the games between the conferences have already been played, I thought it was a decent time to rank the conferences. We had a request to rank the ACC versus the American Conference. We will get to that at some point because I think it's definitely a debatable point as to which conference is better. We never think of a group of five conference, the entire conference being better than another conference in the Power 5. But that one's certainly a good comparison between the ACC and the American Conference. Okay. The worst conference in college football in the Power 5 is the ACC. It's not even close. And they've got the best team possibly in college football, but they're still the worst conference. And it was even a good week for the ACC in that Pitt beat UCF. That in and of itself made it a good week for the ACC, even though North Carolina lost to App State. The rest of the conference pretty much held serve against group of five teams that they should have beaten and beaten badly. Right now, the ACC is 3-7 against the Power 5. So you've got the big win from Clemson over Texas A&M. You've got, what else do we have besides that? We've got North Carolina beat South Carolina. And maybe that's the two. I accidentally marked the UCF win as a Power 5 win. Of course, it's not for the ACC, even though it's a much better win than many other Power 5 wins. But if we're going to categorize, as we should, check that. The ACC's 2-7 against the Power 5. But they defeated the group of five, and they are 17-2 against the group of five. So that's a pretty good record against a group of five, depending on who you're playing, because there's such a discrepancy amongst the group of five in particular. But yeah, the Pitt win over UCF's a decent win, and Clemson over Texas A&M. But Florida State lost to Boise State. NC State lost to West Virginia by 17 points. Wake Forest got a decent win against Utah State. The most embarrassing loss, I think, for the ACC this season has been BC losing as a 23-point favorite by 24 points to Kansas, which had not beaten a Power 5 team on the road in 12 years. Syracuse got annihilated by Maryland. Not a good look. Miami lost to Florida. Miami almost lost to Central Michigan. It's an almost loss. Georgia Tech, 26-point favorite, lost to the Citadel. This is the worst conference in the Power 5. It's not even close. Yeah, just a lot of bad losses. What is left for the ACC is their traditional matchups against the SEC. Clemson, South Carolina, Florida, Florida State, Georgia, Georgia Tech, Kentucky, Louisville, Thanksgiving weekend. Also, Notre Dame still has 4 more games against the ACC. Virginia this week should be a good game. Virginia Tech, Boston College, and Duke. The worst conference, and I'll give it a rating of 3 out of 10, the ACC. Next up would be the Pac-12, and a nice week for the Pac-12. Washington beat BYU, which they should, but considering that BYU was able to steal a win against USC in overtime and also against Tennessee in overtime on the road, decent win for the Pac-12 in not just beating BYU, but beating them badly, 45-19. So Washington with a 26-point win over BYU. And also there was another nice win in here. Oh, Cal beat Ole Miss. They went right down to the last play of the game. And they beat Ole Miss. Maybe they shouldn't even won the game, but they were up 28-13 in the fourth quarter, almost blew it, and won by an inch over Ole Miss. So the Pac-12 over the SEC in that one. The Pac-12 is 7-4 against the Power 5. Pretty good there. 9-6, though, against the group of five is not good. But to the Pac-12's credit, they typically play better competition in the group of five. There's not a whole lot of Conference USA or Sun Belt games. It's a lot of Mountain West, and they took on the American in games against UCF and Cincinnati, San Diego State, Hawaii, Fresno State, games like that. Houston. Against the current top 25, the Pac-12 at 0-3. I did not mention that the ACC is 1-5 against the current top 25. And if Texas A&M dropped out of the top 25, check that. Maybe 0-5 against the current top 25. Big wins for the Pac-12. Colorado beat Nebraska. That might be the biggest. This Cal win over Ole Miss, but Ole Miss is going to be one of the worst teams in the SEC. So the Pac-12 not stacked in quality wins in the big games. Of course, they lost the biggest of games when Oregon lost to Auburn. The Arizona State win against Michigan State. If Michigan State's the expected 8-4 type team, that's a good win for the Pac-12. And, of course, UCLA looking better this week, but they did that against another Pac-12 team. So we'll give the Pac-12 a 4.5 out of 10. On to the Big 12. Bad week for the Big 12. And this is pretty much the reason why. TCU expected to be the 3rd to 5th best team in the conference. By many analysts' viewpoint in the preseason, TCU was considered to be the 3rd best team in the Big 12. They lost to SMU. SMU's not horrible, but that's not a good look for the Big 12. Also, let's see. So some of the good wins for the Big 12 would be Kansas State going to Mississippi State and winning. Good win. TCU not just winning at Purdue, but dominating the game, winning by 3 touchdowns. Kansas with a big 24-point win against BC on the road. And West Virginia winning by 17 points over NC State. So the Big 12 has some decent wins. Texas Tech losing to Arizona is not the worst thing in the world, but by 2 touchdowns, it's not a good win. It's obviously not a win. It's a pretty marginal loss. West Virginia getting annihilated by Missouri. Kansas losing to Coastal Carolina, not a good look for the conference. Iowa State, Iowa, that game came down to a 1-point game, came down to the wire. So technically the Big 12 did lose the game, but losing to a top 25 team in Iowa, not the end of the world. Oklahoma, this is not good for the Big 12, just didn't play anyone. Houston, UCLA. And, of course, Texas lost the big showdown against LSU. Not embarrassed. They hung in the game. They were right there, but they lost, and they lost at home. So against the Power 5, the Big 12 is 6-4. Against the Group of 5, they are 9-1. They've got the FCS loss of Kansas losing to Coastal Carolina, then bouncing back to beat BC. Against the current top 25, the Big 12 is 0-2. Really no games left because everyone in the Big 12 plays 3 non-conference games, and they've all played their non-conference slate, and now it's all Big 12 action from here on out. I give the Big 12 a 6 out of 10 in just a subjective numbering system that doesn't mean much of anything. Just a estimate. For the Big 10, well, Michigan's the down story for the Big Ten this week, but they lost to another Big Ten power in Wisconsin, so that puts Wisconsin in a better place of position to possibly get to the college football playoff. So it's really not a bad week for the Big Ten, but Michigan was supposed to be so good in the preseason. That doesn't look good for the Big Ten. It pretty much knocks out Michigan unless they just rebound in a resounding way. Ohio State playing no one in the Power 5 is not good for the league. The big win for Ohio State is not a big win against Cincinnati. Michigan beat Army. Penn State beat Pitt, which looks better now that Pitt beat UCF. Michigan State with maybe the league's most disappointing loss at home against Arizona State. Maryland beat Syracuse, but then they lost to Temple. Wisconsin didn't play anyone outside the conference. That's not good. Iowa beat Iowa State. Key win against probably the 3rd best team in the Big 12, as it appears right now. Purdue beat Vanderbilt, decent win, and they dominated the game by 18 points, but they also lost to TCU by 21 points, and they lost to Nevada. Not a good look for the Big Ten. Nebraska losing to Colorado. That shouldn't happen, even though Colorado turned around and beat Arizona State. So those teams are, we go through these games, go through these teams, and anyone from about 20 to 25 in the nation all the way up to number 50, those 25, 30, 35 teams, toss up. And Minnesota did what they had to do against Fresno State in winning that game. The Big Ten against the Power 5 is 5-4 against the Group of 5, a fine 20-3 record. 0-2 against the current top 25, though. because basically just about anybody in the top 25 at this stage of the season is undefeated, outside of Texas, Oregon, a couple of other teams at this point, and that's going to change quickly, but just about everyone in the top 25 is undefeated. So basically you're going to be winless against the top 25 at this point. We've gone all through the big games in the Big Ten, the disappointments, and the very few big wins. And really the only big game left for the Big Ten would be Michigan hosting Notre Dame in November. The Big Ten slightly better than the Big 12, but not by much at 6.5 out of 10. Now to the league that is, I don't think without question, and there have been some embarrassing moments for the SEC this season, but still the SEC is the best conference in college football with an 8 out of 10 rating. And this was a great week for the SEC for one simple reason. Georgia beat Notre Dame. If Georgia would have lost that game, still having the best team in the SEC East and presumed winner of the division, going to the SEC championship game with a loss against Notre Dame and then possibly beating the Western Division champion would not have been a great look for the SEC. I'm not saying it would have damaged the SEC's playoff chances, but not a good look. So right now, Bama didn't play anyone. They beat Duke and annihilated Duke. Auburn with a big win against Oregon. Then also, this is actually good news for the SEC in that Auburn followed up the Oregon win by beating Texas A&M. Well, you say, as I would typically say, that doesn't really prove the SEC because somebody's got to win the game, somebody's got to lose the game. It's within the conference. But Texas A&M already lost against Clemson. They're out of the college football playoff race. So this is a good look for the SEC, and it strengthens another top elite team, elite for the time being in Auburn, and then they took care of business against Texas A&M. So Auburn's got 2 big wins under its belt. So that's going to help the matchups against LSU and against Alabama. LSU with the aforementioned big win against Texas. Mississippi State lost to Kansas State. Not a good game. Losing at home to Kansas State by a touchdown, and Ole Miss losing to Memphis and Cal. Arkansas losing to San Jose State. There are embarrassing losses for this conference. It is the best conference, but it is not without stain. Mizzou lost to Wyoming. Tennessee lost to Georgia State and BYU. As I mentioned, Arkansas lost to San Jose State. Ole Miss lost to Cal, who's probably going to turn out to be, what, a 7-5 team? 8-4 possibly. And also lost to Memphis. Vandy lost by 3 scores at Purdue. South Carolina lost to North Carolina. But the big games is where the SEC is coming through. Florida beat Miami. Missouri beat West Virginia. Auburn over Oregon. LSU over Texas. All right, so the SEC is 6-5 against the Power 5, 13-4 against the Group of 5, and currently at 2-1 against the top 25, having defeated Texas and Oregon. So we went through all the big games, and what's left? Well, what's left are the games against the ACC, Georgia, Georgia Tech, Kentucky, Louisville, Florida, Florida State, South Carolina, Clemson. The SEC would appear at this point to be a heavy favorite in 3 of the 4 games and a heavy underdog in the 1 game, of course, with South Carolina taking on the Clemson Tigers. The SEC's an 8 out of 10. There you go. My rankings for the Power 5 with the ACC at number 5, the Pac-12 at number 4. Then we've got the Big 12 at number 3, slightly behind the Big 10 at number 2, and the SEC is the best conference in college football. We shall match up the ACC against the American Conference at some point in the next week or 2 right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Would love to know what you think about the conference rankings and what should determine the best conference and the 1 through 5 rankings. Let's talk it up right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football.